Welcome to Little Koi Out of the Frying Pan, Thriving After Trauma. This blog post is titled Letters from Home. Trigger warning, spiritual abuse. Ellie, we are so glad that you have finally turned back to God so that He can bless you, and so can we. Part of your gift is the enclosed check. The other parts are a week of fun in Tucson with all activities paid for by us, and you don't owe us the rest of the money you borrowed. Love in Him, Dad and Mom. This is an actual letter sent to me by my mother in 2007. I was about 20 at the time. At that time, I lived in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they were still living in Tucson, Arizona. I had moved out of my godparents' house and lived in my own apartment. When I was kicked out of the house in 2004, you can read or listen to that blog story in my previous blog. I moved in with my godparents and began attending Indian Hills Community Church. A little background. My adopted parents had connection in Lincoln made during the time they lived there for many years as newlyweds. While living there, they got involved with the Hills and deemed it as the only godly church real Christians would attend. So, if you lived in Lincoln and you did not attend this church, you must not be serious about your faith. Actually, you probably weren't even saved at all. This church is where they met the couple who would eventually become my siblings and my legal guardians, and who I would move in with at 17 years old after my parents kicked me out. As I was living in Lincoln trying to figure out my own way, I was also trying to figure out my relationship with my parents. Even at 1,200 miles away, it was a continuous battle to stay in my parents' good graces. I had fallen out of their unconditional love too many times to count. However, I knew one significant way to keep them happy was to stay in this church. So I committed myself to serving, including working in the youth and children's ministry, participating in the music ministry, and being heavily active in the college and career group. I would write an email every week to document everything I was doing in this church. It was always met with such high praise from my parents. As long as I was attending this church, my parents were satisfied that I was in God's will. It wasn't long into my experience at the church that I started seeing red flags. First, the church spread fear tactics to people. They have a laundry list of rules Christians must follow to stay in God and the congregation's good graces. They also protect the male abusers in the church. Second, the congregation has seemingly unhealthy adoration of the pastor. Most of the time, I wondered if we worship God or just worship the pastor. It was hard to tell. It was the pastor's way or no way, and don't dare question his teaching. Lastly, I was not making connection in the young adult group. Frankly, I was tired of the guilt trips of not being the best Christian I could be. How is your prayer life? I noticed you missed church last week. I noticed your shorts were a little short at study last week. Remember, we had to keep our brothers in Christ from stumbling. Are you coming to Bible study tomorrow? You've just really been on my heart, and I want to check that your spiritual life is strong. I've been praying that you come to Bible study more often than you have been lately. I hope you're able to find time for your prayer life the way you find time for your hobbies. I felt like I was having to continuously be defending my spiritual life. Heaven forbid I went out with some friends on a Friday night and skipped a Bible study. My spiritual life must have been in ruins. Also, did I mention that the Hills was the only place my parents told me I would find a godly husband? My parents would not approve or hear of any male that did not come from the Hills. There was enormous pressure and very little grace. So I left. I waited several months before telling my parents I had left. That conversation did not go well. My mother cried, and my father told me he was worried about my salvation. They both cut me off. My mother refused to speak to me. Her silent treatments were nothing new to me. Growing up, after she got done hitting me, The silent treatment came next for a minimum of an entire day and or night. If I let her down enough, she would go multiple days or even weeks without speaking to me. Additionally, she would withhold all physical affection and not even make eye contact with me when I was in the room. I often remember wishing she would just scream at me to get it over with so I could be loved again. But she would be silent until she decided I was repentant enough. I would slip notes under her door. One is actually attached to the blog. You can look at the picture if you go to my blog website. I would slip notes under her door, apologizing, groveling, and telling her what a failure I was. I would tell her whatever I thought she wanted to hear so that I could just feel love again. After I left the hills, I was not allowed to interact with my mother until I repented of my sins and returned to the hills. Until then, I was also not allowed home. In addition, my siblings were discouraged from talking to me. Taking myself out of the hills was considered taking myself out of God's will and protection. And because I was willingly taking myself out of God's protection, my parents believed I was in rebellion and they could no longer protect me either. I tried to convince them I had not stopped attending church. Instead, I was seeking out other opportunities, but they would not hear of it. I was in sin. Again and again, they washed their hands of their sinful, rebellious child. I self-soothed by telling myself, well, at least they can't hit me from 1,200 miles away. When my parents couldn't physically hit my body, their silence hit my soul, which was an even deeper pain. After several months, I couldn't take the silence anymore, and I couldn't take the pain. I began to believe I must be in some sin. I must be evil. Why must I make my parents' life so difficult? I thought I must be out of God's will. After all, my parents always told me they knew best for my life. At 20 years old, there was no way I could understand what I wanted or needed. At least that is what they led me to believe. I wanted to be able to come home and visit. As crazy as it sounds, I missed them. Listen when I tell you, reader, that when you are in my parents' good graces, they make it really good for you. They have a powerful hold on people. But on the other hand, when you fall out of the graces at the drop of a hat, they know how to make your life hell. There is no in between. So I started to integrate myself back in the church to be loved again. I was so excited to tell my parents. I told my father, who told my mother, and they were both over the moon. I was back in their grace, receiving affection, praise, gifts, and love. I finally received my parents' love and blessings because I turned back to God. I was allowed to come home again, and they both interacted with me. I was a prodigal son that finally repented of her sins. I would not understand until years later that what my parents did was not only emotional abuse, but also spiritual abuse. They would take my spiritual life and view of God for many years. My parents believed only they knew God's will for my life. They would say that God ordained them to be the leaders over my life, and disagreeing with them was disobedient. And they could not interact with a sinful and disobedient child. My spiritual abuse was one significant reason why I decided from a young age I was not going to have children of my own. I knew that I would never parent my children the way my parents did me, but I also did not want to bring children into a world with such a hateful God. People told me to view God like I would my earthly father. I was told, think about how much your earthly father loves you. Now imagine God's love is even more infinite. I grew up with a father that yelled, screamed, and hit me and my siblings. A father that watched my mother beat me until I nearly blacked out. I grew up with a father that told me I was a family disappointment and a pitiful excuse for a Christian and a daughter. I grew up with a father that threw me to the floor, against the wall, and verbally and physically lusted after my teenage body. Now that I do have my bonus children, my view of God has been evolving. I think about how much I actually love my children and how there is nothing they could ever do to fall out of my good graces or lose my love. I can't fathom them falling out. I can't fathom them falling out of my love. While my faith is still essential, it is not rigid and does not rule my parenting. Our children are empowered to make their own spiritual decisions and walks of faith. One child has chosen Christianity, and the other one is agnostic, and they are both fully supported and loved. I grew up with so much fear of hell that I still have inner battles of guilt about not preaching more to the kids or enforcing the traditional Christian faith. But that has all been a part of my faith deconstruction, which I will explore in future vlogs. Author's note. I was digging around for some photos for another blog post when I came across this letter from my mother today. It inspired this post. While the letter brought up some old feelings, I did not feel self-shame. Instead, I felt pity that they were so willing and able to throw a relationship to the wayside at their whim. And here are the letters. The first letter says, Ellie, we are so glad that you have finally turned back to God so that He can bless you, and so can we. Part of your gift is the enclosed check. The other parts are a week in Tucson with all activities paid by us, and you don't owe us the rest of the money you borrowed. Love and Him, Mom and Dad. This is a letter that they sent me right after I started attending that church again. After my mom found out, they were just over the moon, and they sent me this letter that I could finally come home again. And they showered me with gifts and money and things for my new apartment. I was in God's will again, and because I was in God's will again, they could love me again. The second letter is a letter that I found that I wrote to my mom. She had kept it and put it in my baby book. And here's what it says. Dear Mom, I am extremely sorry for what I said and did today. As usual, I turned a simple request into a huge argument and again hurt you. Mom, I have failed you as a daughter. All I had to do was the chore, and this whole argument would have been avoided. You deserve so much more love and respect, and I have failed giving it to you. I want to have a good relationship, Mom. I love you dearly. I know it doesn't seem like that a lot, but I really love you. I hope that you will forgive me. I love you, Mom. Love, Ellie. I don't remember the whole context of this letter. Obviously, it was over a chore that I did not want to do at that moment in time, most likely. And obviously, an argument ensued, and she gave me the silent treatment, and this was a note that I probably left under her door because I was tired of the silent treatment. So, anyway, there's that. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.